Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really crucial and frankly quite challenging area in mental health: psychiatric emergencies. We're drawing heavily from core texts like Kaplan and Sadock's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, absolutely essential though. Our
Mm.
goal here is to break down these complex protocols, risk assessment, stabilization techniques into something clear and accessible.
Right, a roadmap for managing these immediate safety crises.
Exactly. And we're looking at suicidal behavior not just as a symptom, but really as a complex public health issue. It needs a very structured, multidimensional approach.
And that structure, it seems to start with this core idea of risk, which the sources frame using the stress vulnerability model. Could you walk us through that?
Sure.
Like, why is understanding this sort of baseline vulnerability just as important as the immediate stressor in a crisis?
That's a great point. The model assumes that people react differently to the same stress. It suggests there's a kind of constitutional predisposition, a diathesis or trait that sets an individual's personal threshold for suicidality. Okay, then stressors may be internal, like an illness relapse, or external, like losing a job, interact with that underlying trait. Understanding the diathesis helps us gauge the baseline risk.
So it makes prevention more of a long game, not just reacting to the fire?
Precisely. It's not an on-off switch, it's more like a dynamic tipping point.
Right.
And you see the suicidal process itself often evolves from passive thoughts, maybe death wishes,
Right.
to more concrete ideation, and then potentially to attempts. And the sources really emphasize protective factors here.
Yeah, talk about those. What acts as a buffer?
Well, things like strong social connections, cognitive flexibility, being able to think differently about problems, active coping skills, they act like shock absorbers.
Okay.
They raise that threshold, making it harder for acute stressors to push someone into crisis. And this informs public health strategies too, like means restriction, which directly targets that critical, often brief window when the impulse is strongest.
And the scale of this problem globally, it's quite shocking when you see the numbers.
It is.
Suicide is a major cause of death worldwide. Over 700,000 deaths annually. The sources point out that's more than breast cancer, war, and homicide combined.
Yeah, that context really underscores why this is an emergency field. The global age standardized rate is around 9 per 100,000 people.
9 per 100,000.
And there's a very consistent gender pattern. In nearly all WHO regions, the rate for males is more than double that for females. We're talking about 13.25 for men versus 5.74 for women globally.
That's a huge difference. And age plays a big role too, but maybe not how people expect.
Right. It's tragic that suicide is the fourth leading cause of death globally for young people, 15 to 29.
Fourth leading cause.
Oh. But the absolute highest rates for both men and women are actually found in older adults, specifically people 70 and older.
So it hits both ends of the age spectrum hard.
It does. And then there are other factors, sociodemographics,
Yeah.
like being unmarried, being a veteran, unemployment. These all increase risk. And crucially, childhood adversities. There's growing research linking this to epigenetic changes, which can significantly raise lifetime risk.
But there are protective things too.
Absolutely. Strong connections, family, school, those act as buffers, especially for younger people.
Okay, let's connect this to psychiatric illness directly. The link is really strong, isn't it? The sources use risk ratios, RR, to show this.
Yes, very strong. For psychotic disorders, the RR is 13.2. For mood disorders, it's almost identical, 12.3.
13 times the risk. What does that mean in practice?
It means psychiatric disorders are probably the single biggest modifiable risk factor we can target. The sources suggest treating the underlying disorder could prevent maybe up to 21% of suicides.
That's significant.
And the risk varies within disorders too. Take bipolar disorder suicide causes 15% to 20% of deaths in that group, often during depressive or mixed episodes, not just mania.
And for personality disorders, I know borderline personality disorder, BPD, comes up a lot.
It does, and the numbers are stark. BPD has the highest suicide rate among personality disorders. About 10% die by suicide.
10%.
And somewhere between 50% and 90% report a past attempt. This kind of risk concentration is why we have to move beyond basic screening to structured, mandatory assessment in clinical settings.
Which brings us right into that clinical setting. The mandate seems clear. Every psychiatric evaluation needs a documented suicide risk assessment.
Absolutely.
And the sources say prevention is doable, even if we can't perfectly predict who. So how do clinicians get beyond that surface level, are you feeling suicidal question?
Yeah, that often doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
This is where specialized interview techniques come in. The main one discussed is the case approach chronological assessment of suicide events.
Case approach.
Developed by Shea, it's designed to uncover the full picture, what the patient says, what their actions imply, and maybe what they're holding back.
How does it actually work? What are those techniques?
Well, subtle things, like gentle assumption. The interviewer might assume some level of suicidal thinking is present, which paradoxically makes it easier for the patient to confirm it.
Right, less confrontational.
Exactly. Or denial of the specific, asking more open-ended questions about methods rather than just, do you have a plan to use X? It creates a safer space for disclosure.
Okay, so once the risk is assessed, what's the immediate next step? You mentioned safety planning.
Yes, the safety planning intervention. Crucially, it's collaborative. The patient has to be involved in creating it.
Makes sense.
It identifies their personal warning signs, their internal coping strategies, who they can reach out to for external support.
And critically, means restriction.
Absolutely critical.
Mm.
Means restriction is a core part of any safety plan. It means figuring out what lethal means the person has access to, especially firearms, medications, and then actively working to limit that access.
Reducing the immediate danger.
Exactly. If someone is acutely suicidal, making lethal methods harder to access buys invaluable time and can dramatically improve short-term safety. It interrupts that impulse.
So it sounds like a combination of talk, planning, and sometimes specific medications. What biological treatments have strong evidence specifically for reducing suicide risk itself?
Good question. Two stand out. Lithium shows a significant reduction in suicide and attempts, especially for people with bipolar disorder.
Okay, lithium.
And clozapine is actually the only FDA-approved medication with a specific indication to reduce suicide risk in patients with schizophrenia.
Only clozapine for schizophrenia. Interesting.
Yeah. And there's also mention of things like ECT for severe depression with suicidality and growing research on ketamine infusions for rapidly reducing acute suicidal thoughts.
And what about psychotherapies? Not just treating depression generally, but therapies targeting suicidal behavior itself.
Right. That's a key distinction.
Yeah.
DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is often called the gold standard, especially for BPD, but it works for reducing suicidal behaviors in other conditions, too.
DBT.
Okay.
Then there's CBTSP cognitive therapy for suicidal patients. It's a relatively short program, maybe 10 sessions, structured, and studies show it can cut reattempts by half.
50% reduction, that's huge. And the third one mentioned is CAMS.
Yes, CAMS, Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality.
What makes CAMS different?
The main thing about CAMS is that it's a framework designed to keep the patient's suicidality, the thoughts, the feelings, the urges, as the central focus of treatment in every session.
Laser focused on the suicide risk itself.
Exactly. It uses a tool called the Suicide Status Form, the SSF, to track risk collaboratively with the patient. They're an active partner in managing their own safety.
That progression from assessment to targeted therapy is vital. But it often starts in the emergency setting, doesn't it? Let's shift to the broader world of emergency psychiatry services, PES. The history is quite something.
It really is. Formalized emergency psychiatry kind of grew out of military psychiatry back in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905.
Really? How so?
Clinicians found that providing brief, crisis-focused therapy, things like abreaction, letting soldiers ventilate their experiences right there near the front lines, was incredibly effective.
Wow. And we have data on that.
We do. By World War II, when the U.S. Army implemented these methods more formally for battle fatigue, the return-to-duty rates shot up dramatically. We're talking like 85% by 1944.
85%? That's incredible.
It showed that quick, focused intervention can make a massive difference in outcomes and prevent long-term problems.
So, drawing from that history, what are the absolute top priorities for a modern PECI assessment when someone arrives in crisis? The sources list 3.
Yeah, 3 core priorities guide everything. Number 1, control aggressive behavior. That means ensuring safety for everyone, staff, other patients, the patient themselves.
Well,
Weapon screening, panic buttons, trying to keep the environment calm, minimize stimuli.
safety first. Makes sense. Number 2 is crucial and maybe easily overlooked outside crisis settings. Rule out medical etiology.
Extremely important. Clinicians have to keep a high index of suspicion for underlying medical causes, especially for patients over 40 or under 12 with no prior psychiatric history, or anyone presenting with a very sudden onset, a fluctuating course, confusion, altered consciousness. You need to rule out intoxication, infection, metabolic issues, neurological problems before jumping to a psychiatric diagnosis.
Got it. And the third priority?
Facilitate evaluation and disposition. This means doing a thorough assessment, often needing collateral information, talking to family, police, looking at old records, especially if the patient can't provide a reliable history.
Right.
And then meticulous documentation, recording the risk factors, the protective factors, and the clear rationale for the decision, whether it's admission or discharge.
When dealing with agitation or aggression, you mentioned control is priority one. What's the first line approach?
Verbal de-escalation. Always try that first. It's about respect, empathy, giving the person space, listening actively.
And what's the big mistake to avoid?
Trying to argue or use logic to correct someone's delusions or paranoia when they're highly agitated. It almost always backfires, makes them more defensive and escalated.
Okay, don't argue with the delusion. If words fail, then medication might be needed. What are the goals and the safety points there?
The goal is to calm the patient without knocking them out, just enough to allow for safe evaluation. Usually you'd start with oral meds if possible, like risperidone or olanzapine.
And if you need something faster, intramuscular.
IM options include things like ziprasidone or a combination of haloperidol plus lorazepam.
Okay.
But there's a huge safety warning the sources emphasize. Do not combine intramuscular lorazepam with intramuscular olanzapine.
Why not?
There's a significant risk of severe cardiorespiratory depression, basically, problems with breathing and heart function. It's a potentially dangerous combination.
That's a critical point. Okay, let's pivot to substance-related emergencies. Which one carries the highest mortality risk?
Alcohol withdrawal. It's a true medical emergency, not just psychiatric. It can absolutely lead to death, particularly from delirium tremens, or DTs. Mortality rates for DTs can range from 4% up to 20%. Symptoms usually peak around 24 to 48 hours after the last drink.
In treatment?
It requires benzodiazepines like corticosteroid, Librium, or lorazepam, Ativan, on a symptom-triggered or fixed schedule to prevent seizures and DTs, and also thiamine, usually given IM initially, because chronic alcohol use often leads to severe vitamin deficiencies, like Wernicke's encephalopathy.
So alcohol withdrawal is potentially fatal. How do other common withdrawals compare, like benzodiazepines?
Benzo withdrawal is very similar to alcohol withdrawal. It can also be life-threatening, causing seizures and delirium. It needs very careful management, usually a slow taper, sometimes substituting a longer-acting benzo or even phenobarbital.
Okay, also dangerous. What about opioid withdrawal? We hear a lot about that.
Opioid withdrawal feels absolutely terrible for the person going through it, like the worst clue imaginable, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. But, and this is key, it is not typically life-threatening on its own.
Not life-threatening. That's a major distinction.
Huge distinction. Management is focused on comfort measures, using non-opioid meds to manage symptoms, or potentially starting buprenorphine in the emergency setting, but only once the patient is clearly in withdrawal.
Right. Now, what about intoxication states? Stimulants, for example.
Stimulant intoxication from cocaine or amphetamines often presents with agitation, paranoia, sometimes psychosis. Physically, you might see things like high heart rate, high blood pressure, maybe hyperthermia. Treatment usually involves a quiet, low-stimulus environment, reassurance, and often benzodiazepines for agitation. Sometimes antipsychotics if psychosis is prominent.
And what about PCP? That one has a particularly notorious reputation.
Yeah, PCP, or phencyclidine, is tricky. It can mimic schizophrenia, cause bizarre behavior, but it's especially associated with extreme, unpredictable violence and agitation. Patients might feel impervious to pain.
And that leads to specific risks with physical management.
It does. If physical restraint is absolutely necessary for a patient intoxicated with PCP, it needs to be done very carefully. Total body immobilization might be needed, because the extreme agitation and muscle rigidity can lead to rhabdomyolysis, that's rapid breakdown of muscle tissue, which can then cause acute kidney failure. Careful monitoring is essential.
Wow, that's serious. Okay, let's wrap up with some of the critical, legal, and psychosocial issues that come up constantly in the PES. Confidentiality seems like a big one.
Absolutely fundamental, but it's not absolute. The main exception is the duty to warn.
Can you explain that?
If a clinician believes there's a credible threat of serious physical harm to a specific, identifiable third party, they have a legal and ethical obligation to take steps to warn that potential victim and law enforcement. Confidentiality is waived in that specific situation.
Okay, duty to warn. What about capacity versus competency? People often confuse those.
They do. It's a crucial distinction. Capacity is a clinical determination made by a doctor. It's about whether a patient can understand information, appreciate the situation, reason, and communicate a choice about their own health care right now.
A clinical judgment.
Yes. Competency, on the other hand, is a legal determination made only by a judge in court. All adults are presumed legally competent unless a court declares otherwise.
So a doctor assesses capacity, a judge determines competency.
Exactly, and this distinction directly impacts things like involuntary commitment.
Right. You can't just hold someone against their will simply because they have a mental illness.
Precisely. Taking away someone's civil liberties is a very high bar. The criteria typically require demonstrating that the person is dangerous to themselves, dangerous to others, or are unable to provide for their basic needs, sometimes called gravely disabled, specifically as a result of their mental illness. The mental illness alone isn't enough.
And this is where documentation becomes absolutely critical.
Paramount. The medical record is the legal document. It has to clearly lay out the assessment findings, the risk factors, the protective factors, the rationale for the clinical decisions, especially if that decision involves involuntary treatment, or, conversely, discharging someone who presents some risk. Every step needs justification.
So wrapping this all up, we've journeyed through the stress vulnerability model, looked at specific evidence-based treatments like lithium and clozapine, DBT.
And laid out those 3 core priorities for any psychiatric emergency. Safety first, always rule out medical causes, and then facilitate a comprehensive evaluation and disposition plan.
Understanding these protocols, from those specific interview techniques like CASE to the nuances of medication for agitation, remembering that crucial olanzapine-lorazepam warning, it really gives you a framework for grasping crisis intervention.
It does. It provides a vital foundation for understanding how safety is managed in these incredibly high-stakes situations.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. We know from the data that the period right after someone leaves the hospital is one of the highest risk times for suicide.
That's right. That immediate post-discharge window is critical.
So the question is, beyond the emergency room, what are the most innovative ways community resources could step in to provide that continuous caring contact, like a safety bridge, to support people through that really dangerous gap?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Bridging that gap effectively is the next frontier for truly comprehensive safety.
A really vital question to consider. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope you found it informative.